Yeah, so there's a Cal Osprey workshop on April 12th. I think I got that right. And it's about detection and recovery of floating oil in where it's site compromised, right, night or in fog. So the details of that will be posted on the OSPR website. So anybody who's interested in that can go to that website.
Okay, so Tim, should we start?
Yeah, let's go ahead, Lynn.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our OSPR Response Knowledge Transfer webinar. And we hosted 5 webinars last year, and this is the first one in 2022. So welcome, and also Happy New Year. This is the first day of Chinese Lunar Year. So first thing I want to mention is that we are going to record the whole webinar session with video and also audio. So so if you don't want to be announced by your name, you can send out questions anonymously. And we also post the recordings to a API website. So I included the link in the meeting invite. We already released the first 4 webinars. If you missed out any of them, you can go and check it out. I will try to release the webinar 5 and this one shortly. And the purpose of the webinar is to give a platform to allow the very seasoned OSPR response experts to share their knowledge to the less experienced like me, and also give a platform to allow us to share different perspectives and insights. The webinar we're trying to organize is a monthly basis. So we held the webinar every first Tuesday of the month. And it's like 1 hour and 15 minutes from 10 a.m., start from 10 a.m. US Houston time. We're still trying to find suitable speakers for next month. And if we cannot find one, we may skip March, but if we can find one quickly, I will send out the invite for next webinar quickly. So the format for the talk is we'll give the speaker 1 hour to speak, and then about 50 minutes for questions. And the questions can only be sent out through Q&A button. We'll go through the Q&As, and if we pass the scheduled webinar time, as before, we just continue going through those questions. And if you like to stay, we're welcome to stay with us. And I think that's all I need to announce. And next, my colleague Tim Knapwhite will introduce our speaker, Chris Reddy. Tim, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, first I want to thank Chris for taking the time, because I know this isn't just something you wake up and give a presentation like this, and he's given a lot of thought to this. So I appreciate taking the time to do that, Chris. But a lot of people know Chris Reddy, but he's been working at Woodson Soul Institute for a long time and has a lot of experience on both the response side with that understanding, but also on the research side of oil spill response. So you can see the title of his slide. It's up on the screen. So he's going to share his experiences and lessons learned in oil spill response from more of an academic perspective. But I think Chris is one of these academics who certainly understands the response side of things. So he's a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and studies marine pollution, petroleum geochemistry, and develops natural products for the cosmetics industry. When the Deepwater Horizon disaster occurred in 2010, Chris pivoted to focus much of his research on this spill. He spent nearly a decade tracing nature's response to the thousands of chemical compounds released to determine what biodegraded and evaporated, and what is still present in the Gulf of Mexico. Chris has extensive experience communicating science to the media, policymakers, and the public. He has written nearly 20 opinion pieces, which is kind of phenomenal. He's testified before Congress and Senate 5 times and given hundreds of interviews. In 2014, he was honored with the prestigious International C.C. Patterson Award for leading an innovative breakthrough of fundamental significance in environmental geochemistry, particularly in service society. More recently, he was honored as a 2018 fellow in the American Geophysical Union, bestowed with their ambassador award. I've known Chris for, gosh, at least 10 years now. I think we first met at a NOAA workshop that Nancy Kinn held. Gosh, I can't remember when it was, around 2010 or so. But what strikes me with Chris is that he has a perspective that's not just an academic perspective. And what I remember is the presentation, Chris, you gave at the National Academies on the dispersant study. And one of the things that I've known for a long time is that oil spill response and decision making is not an objective science, right? Perceptions very often rule the day. And so what you argued at that National Academy things, which really impressed me, is that there's a need to understand the psychology of oil spill response, because people's impressions can change things and not necessarily in the right direction. So I'm gonna turn over things to Chris, and I think he's going to go through some of those issues in this talk. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks a lot for Lynn and Tim for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be talking science amongst a lot of snow where I live. So, but let me just jump in. Notably, I'm not going to talk about Deepwater Horizon. I'm not going to talk about some moments in my life in 2003, and bring us up to something in the last 6 or 7 months. So my talk is mainly about my perspective about academia and oil spills, but I suspect there's some lessons learned for all of us, not only academics, but how the response community and the media and other stakeholders think about academia, maybe what they don't think and what they should think about. Let's see. So, you know, as much as I study oil spills, I'm much more interested in about how nature responds to these uninvited gas, to these pollutants, and taking that knowledge gained and trying to figure out how you can make next generation materials and products. So it's a compound that doesn't break down. Why does it not break down? Can we take advantage of that toughness or lack thereof and think about it in making next generation materials? Oil spills to me are fascinating because there's such a diverse group of chemicals. And some point early in my career, I noticed that the action where a lot was going on during an oil spill was in the first hours and days. And so I started to get really interested in studying oil spills early on, because a lot of processes were happening, and they were happening fast. And so that's how I started studying oil spills. We study oil spills early on, you start getting involved with the response. And this is where I'll be talking about for the rest of the day. I'm going to talk about 2 experiences, bookended. The Bouchard 120 oil spill, which happened in 2003, right here in Buzzards Bay, where I'm at. And then some work in Sri Lanka that I'm ongoing on this cargo vessel called the Express Pearl, which caught fire last May 2021 and released a diverse group of chemicals, and the work that I've done in that kind of response arena. So I just got to talk about how badly I performed from a response community's perspective, working on the Bouchard 120, and how I learned about different cultures and different roles after that spill, and how that what happened during the 2003 spill really primed me for the rest of my career, even though it wasn't a very big spill. And then I'm going to take those lessons that I learned and thought about them. Time I was helping out in Sri Lanka, the other side of the world. So 2000, first day of class, and the Express Pearl, which happened, still ongoing per se, is kind of my senior project. Oh no. My internet says it's being a little hinky. That's why I got scared. So yeah, I mean, if you leave right now, if you could just hang in there, one thing I learned is first impressions can be wrong. That talking to people over coffee is way better than email. that a successful outcome, both in oil spills and I guess in life, is to understand and respect the other folks who you're going to interact with. People always say, oh, know your audience. I don't think that's the right point. I think it's more like have coffee with your audience and appreciate their lives and what they need. Later on, I'm going to talk about plastics and that this ship, the Express Pearl, spilled a lot of plastic. And I think studying plastics is very hard. Studying plastics that got burnt on the ship makes it even harder. And I think that the Express Pearl sheds light on the challenges we face with the backup of cargo vessels right now, and that what's on these cargo vessels is much more diverse and ever changing. And I think it puts a lot of challenges in place. Although I think our knowledge from oil spills makes us well ready to respond, almost I would say pre-adapted. So I've always been kind of bratty, but I would say I was particularly bratty and naive and full of myself in January of 2003. Because I once said to somebody, when there's an oil spill, people call me. And the funny thing is, a friend of mine heard me say that, and she reminds me that I say that all the time. And it was said very obnoxious and kind of cocky. And I had the right to say that because I studied 2 oil spills. So I certainly was an expert at that time. My PhD, part of my PhD, I studied the North Cape oil spill along the coast of Rhode Island. And that was a mixture of diesel fuel and home heating fuel oil. And I worked on that and, made some insights and got myself on the front page of the newspaper. And certainly it ballooned my ego, although I think it was good science. And then once I came to, I did my PhD at the University of Rhode Island. And then when I came to work on my postdoc at Woods Oceanographic, John Farrington had said, well, why don't you go and check out whether or not there's any oil remaining from the 1969 West Falmouth spill. So, or sometimes it's called, the barge was the Florida. The last time they had been out there was about 10 years ago, 10 years earlier. He said, you should go check out, see if there's any oil still remaining. So John has always had great advice, and I went out there and started about a decade of work going back and revisiting this oil spill. It's a living laboratory. And the first paper that I published on that went back. We looked at some salt marsh cores. You can see I published this paper in 2002, about the fall of 2002. We nicely showed that in the salt marshes that around 15 centimeters below the surface, there was still oil. It was heavily degraded diesel fuel, and then below it wasn't. And then after that, I kind of riffed off and thought about new technologies that you could use to study this remnant oil. And I got a lot of press. A lot of people were fascinating, and of course they ran with the idea that oil lasts forever, despite I will say, my hard-earned efforts to remind people that it wasn't a lot of oil there and that it was a living laboratory. But you can't control the press sometimes, and they made it pretty dire sounding. And I don't think that made a lot of people happy with me, despite my best efforts not to. So 5-6 months later, after the West Falmouth spill came out, which I said that oil can last for 40 years in distinct areas, there's another oil spill, the Bouchard 120. In this case, it was carrying number 6 or bunker fuel oil. It was going up along Buzzards Bay, and it was going to drop off oil at a power plant, maybe like 20 miles away from there. And it was a Sunday night in April, and it released some pretty sticky oil. And I was out there pretty quickly with my buddy Bob Nelson, and we got a boat ride. I would say that I heard about it early Monday morning. I would say that we were collecting samples Monday morning, maybe by 11 a.m. So, maybe 18 hours after oil got released, we were collecting field samples. That was on a Monday. We were collecting the samples. We were going back to the lab, analyzing them. And that's what we're doing every day. I know I did some press interviews and was communicating with the local NGO, non-governmental organization, the Coalition for Buzzards Bay. So maybe on the Thursday, so 4 or 5 days later, I was invited to give a talk, kind of a big town hall meeting in New Bedford, which is on the other side of Buzzards Bay, to talk about the oil spill. It was a big deal locally. And I finally got that phone call. That phone call that's, I said, when I was so boasting about my greatness, I got the phone call. And it was the Friday before, the day before this seminar I was supposed to give. And it was from a very talented, and I have tremendous respect for, kind of oil spill scientist. We'll leave it at that. And this person reminded me that the Bouchard 120, this ongoing event, was not another West Falmouth spill. This person wanted me to be very clear that when I spoke tomorrow, that if I brought up the West Falmouth spill, that I needed to be very careful not to say the Bouchard 20 was another spill. I was not happy that I was getting a phone call from somebody in the oil spill community that was trying to censor me the day before a meeting. Although now I totally appreciate that effort, and I'm very good friends with that person. So I'm okay with it, but I can tell you that day before, somebody telling me what I can and cannot speak about drove me nuts. I was so mad. Anyways, next day I show up at this, the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It was a really pretty place, and it was packed. And it was packed with a really diverse audience. People in the response community, lay public, they want to know whether or not they should be selling their houses, media, business folks, the government. There was some academics there, non-government organizations. There was a guy who was a fisher who was, people were trying to figure out whether or not they can start fishing and feeding their family. What I've learned now is that giving talks to diverse audiences as a scientist is about as hard as it gets. It's very tricky because each one of these folks has a different interest and want and desire. And that's an ongoing theme in this talk, is that the more diverse your audience as a scientist or any person, the trickier it gets. Because everybody has a different interest and a different means of communicating and what they define as success. So I don't know whether or not there was a speaker either before or after me, but I will say that I came in a pressed blue suit. I knew I had shaved. And it's funny, I actually thought that morning when I was leaving my house that I looked good. And I remember talking to myself and looking at my PowerPoint deck and saying, well, this is such a pretty deck. And I was very, very confident. And either you speaker right before me or right after me, who I immediately coined rumpled jeans. And it was this guy who came up, and he looked like he just rolled out of bed. And he gave the worst talk. It literally was still with overhead slides, and the overhead slides looked like they were made before I was born. He was not happy to be there. He was kind of reluctantly giving this presentation. I thought he was annoyed. And at one point he kind of held out this small little kind of field guide that that NOAA must have used for oil spills. And he kind of held it there and he said, well, this is what we use. And he didn't say anything about the Bouchard 120. And, as an audience member, and I think a lot of folks in the audience, they really wanted to hear about the spill, whereas this person really talked about the process. I was totally unimpressed. And was kind of like, oh my gosh, this guy doesn't even look good. His slide looks terrible. It doesn't even want to be there. And on my side, I gave the most prettiest talk ever and was talking about this new technology called comprehensive two-dimensional gas chromatography. And this is a chromatogram of the oil, one of the first samples we collected. And I showed this diverse audience these unbelievable, chromatograms. And I was really driving home to the fact that the separation was unbelievable. Like, we were separating compounds that always would have co-eluted. I mean, honestly, I was thinking like that. that my chromatography was spectacular. I was getting tremendous resolution. I remember either thinking or kind of, there isn't a videotape of that talk, but I can tell you what my mindset was, is that I told that audience that I thought that with the technology that we had and the lessons that we learned scientifically, how to approach oil spills from the West Falmouth spill, so I thought that we were on the precipice of trying to get the most advanced weathering profile. I told the audience that I was well positioned to disentangle losses of evaporation versus water washing. That often is difficult to apportion because same compounds can be acted upon by both processes. And then I was like, and we can even do something cooler. We can actually show that if the microbes are eating the oil, we can see that carbon that they're eating in their biomass, and which is, super exciting. I gave this presentation and I thought it went great. And, what I predicted and what I thought I was going to do, I actually did. That first part number 1, we published a paper in 2006. So 3 years later, start talking about weathering profiles. Number 2, talking about disentangling evaporation and water washing. First paper came out in 3 years later. Won a big paper, got the cover of Analytical Chemistry. We came back with 2 papers written by my postdoc at the time, Sam Airy, which are spectacular papers, published in 2007, back-to-back papers. Then we were able to show that the carbon, that some of the microbes were actually eating the carbon, and we could show that it was happening. We were tracing the carbon that was in there with a natural tracer, not like a radioactive tracer. Well, naturally produced. And we published the first paper there in 2006. So what I said I was going to do in May 2003, I delivered 3 to 4 years later. And I remember leaving and driving home and thinking that that was the greatest presentation I've ever given. 18 years later, it was an F. Total bomb. Just the worst talk ever. I failed. I'm pretty sure that I left that audience hungry. I gave them gourmet food. I think they just wanted comfort food. I was talking about that I was going to bring them to some cordon bleu restaurant but you had to wait 3 years for a reservation. And I'm pretty sure that most of those folks in that audience would have been happy with a Coke and a hot dog. It's not to say they didn't have a refined palate, but that's what they needed at that time. They didn't want to wait. They didn't understand that at that time. I didn't ask what anybody wanted me to talk about. I just gave a talk about what I thought was interesting, not necessarily what other folks would be thinking about. Nobody told me what to talk about, although I was told not to talk about. Rumple James was Steve Lehman, just recently retired for NOAA as a scientific support coordinator. Again, it was like the worst talk ever, in my mind. 2003. I think now, basically he didn't want to be there in part because he hadn't slept. He had just left the Unified Command. He had bigger issues to do than going to a town hall meeting. Maybe so about a week later, and I was talking to the press, I was still doing work there. Steve started to send emails back and forth with me, and one of them started out with, "You're getting a lot of FaceTime on the news." If you read the rest of these emails, it was clear that he wasn't happy with me. He was having demands of me. He wanted me to share my data. He had heard that I was talking to somebody who did cleanup. He was reminding me all the rules. I will tell you that the emails were not very friendly. They weren't very inviting. Of course, they were coming via email. I walked away in 2003, but the thing was too, I wasn't really worried. Steve Lehman was not going to make a decision with my tenure file. He didn't have any weight. He wasn't going to review any of my papers. And it was clear that he wasn't going to provide any funding for me. So tenure, papers, and funding, if you don't touch upon that, I wasn't worried. I was annoyed because my ego was a little upset and I was frustrated that this guy didn't understand me. But that was it. But we left the Bouchard 120 and things go on. And I ended up working a little bit on the Costco Busan early on. And then one of my graduate students worked on the Costco Busan oil spill, which also was a bunker fuel that spilled in San Francisco Bay. I wrote a little piece about this and also annoyed Steve then. So I had followed up annoying Steve from 2003 into 2007. And along the way, from this period, from like 2003, up to about 2009, I know that I had said in front of my really close friend, who's a fantastic chemist, who also was Rick Gaines at the Coast Guard, who was at that time teaching at the Coast Guard Academy, but he had spent time in the response community, oil spill response. He was a tremendous chemist. And twice, somehow or another, Lehman's name came up. And the second time I said something like, ugh, guy gives the worst talk, he was nasty to me. Rick stopped the conversation and yelled at me. And he's a real gentleman. And he reminded me that, if you owned your own island and you had an oil spill, you'd be begging Steve Lehman to come help you. And he had told me that I completely didn't understand Steve Lehman and that I was completely wrong about my thoughts about him. So that was maybe, I don't know, the second time he said, he really spoke to me. I would say that was probably 2007, 2008 as well. And by chance, Nancy Kinner had invited me to this workshop about 1 year before Deepwater Horizon. It was a fantastic workshop with a lot of oil spill folks there. And in fact, if you looked at the attendance log of the folks there 1 year before Deepwater, it was just about every player was there. And I can't remember exactly who arranged that Steve and I would meet and have a beer before dinner. And I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Steve. But either way, Steve and I hung out for maybe an hour. And it was great. And Steve is not a diplomat. God bless him. And I love him to death, by the way. I think his first, after his first sip of his beer, he told me that I was a guerrilla geochemist. His point was that I was an academic geochemist who would be making some measurements and, taking these little pot shots while he was at the Unified Command. And that, I was annoying and I was frustrating. So that was his opening salvo. So he wasn't doing that well. But then he spoke to me and he said, we talked for a long time, and this is just one piece of this conversation. He said, every time you talk to the press, you make my job harder at the Unified Command. And he said, here's why. And he explained to me that if I said something to the press, whether it was accurate or not, that it would most likely be amplified. And then he would be charged, or somebody at the Unified Command would be charged to, think about or respond to that for whether or not it was from a stakeholder, from their bosses. He was clear that he wasn't censoring me. He was just explaining to me that what his job was, what he considered success, and what he needed. Again, he wasn't censoring me. He just basically responded. And he was telling me he was annoyed with me and he was frustrated with me from 2003 because what I was doing in his mind, in the Unified Command's mind, was acting like a guerrilla geochemist. I didn't mean to do that, but it dawned on me the things that I had done that would have happened. I could remember 2 interviews. It was an enlightening experience that Steve explained to me, and I explained to him a little bit about my world, but it was much more of Steve telling me how his world was. And I walked away in Durham, New Hampshire, after having that beer or drink with him, completely changed, and thinking that that he was great. And that I've had this kind of this figure throughout my career, last maybe 10, 15 years, thinking about that, that when you have an oil spill, it's an intersection of interests. And you have this machinery that starts turning as part of when you have to respond to an oil spill. And like it or not, there's a lot of cogs. And to have a smooth response, all these cogs have to be somewhat synchronized. And Tim's conversation with me was one of the first aha moments about how different stakeholders, whether they mean it or not, how they could affect the response. And it was a lightning moment in my life. And Steve Lehman went from rumpled jeans to a really smart, cool guy who was candid, who spoke to me, face to face. He didn't sugarcoat it at all. But he was a good guy, and he explained to me in a way that he wasn't talking down to me. It was great. And that experience, 1 year before Deepwater Horizon, I couldn't cement enough supports a statement that Thad Allen said frequently during the Deepwater Horizon, that you don't exchange business cards at a crisis, that you don't talk to each other and try to figure out who you are and what your job is and what your role is at a crisis. You do it beforehand. And this was a perfect case study. I was with Steve a year earlier, and we created a relationship, and we began to develop a trust and a mutual respect for each other that stands very strong now. In fact, I was pretty bummed out that he retired on me. I lost the slide. And, look, this is a classic case of first impressions. This is some quote. If you go and Google, wrong first impressions, there's no shortage of them. This is the first one that popped up. And think about this as an academic, young academic, doesn't understand how a response works. Steve Lehman is busy, battle hardened, been there, done that, trying to make a bad thing from getting worse. Let's think about how our first impressions played out. Impressions can be wrong because of past experiences, current mood, surroundings, and other experiences. The point is that I developed a wrong first impression. It took 6 years to resolve, but it happened, and that's life. But it's an opportunity to remind you folks out there, and all of us, that especially I think there is a lot of tension often with academia and the response community. Now, I'm not telling every academic that they have to do how I do things. They can do whatever they want. But the point of the matter is it's valuable to understand the stakeholder of a responder, or somebody who represents the company that's the responsible spiller, whether it's the media, elected folks. They all have a different interest and a goal. When you appreciate their different, how their different cogs run, I think it works out better in the long run. During Deepwater Horizon, at one point, I was lucky enough to be invited down in September of 2010 to work at the Unified Command, and kind of being what was called an academic liaison. And I had the real treat to sit next to Tim. I mean, not Tim. Tim, I wish I did, Tim Nedwood, to sit next to Steve. And Steve and I worked shoulder to shoulder. I was there for maybe 2 weeks. And one day, while we were prepping to give a whole series of briefings to elected officials and bureaucrats and other folks, as we were prepping, Steve and I were helping Admiral Zunkoff at that time. He was the FOSC. There was another scientist who was in the media making some statements about stuff, which that person was allowed to do. But those statements found their way into every conversation that day. That people would show up and they'd say, well, what about this? I'm hearing about this in the news. And we didn't know, Steve and I didn't know. And at one point, Steve turned to me and he said, and that is guerrilla geochemistry. And it was a very telling moment because I could see exactly what happened. That this person who's a very, very good scientist, was making a statement, and that statement found its way into a day-long series of briefings with the director of the FDA, some local officials, and other folks there. It was a big moment that I actually got to see Steve's words in action. And when you think about academia and the response community, I often think about four things and how we differ. I think we differ a lot in how we what's time to us, how do we handle uncertainty? Like scientists need, my world, you have to be pretty certain. And it takes 3 years, 4 years for these papers to come out. The response community will take some good knowledge in hours if that helps them make the most well-informed decision. Along the way, there is a certain amount of risk on every side. And, scientists are not very risky. We try not to be. And then you have to think about reward. So there is a time component, there's a certainty component, there's a risk component, and then there's a reward component. What do each different stakeholder have as a reward? My reward, was my tenure file in 2006. So 3 years later, Steve's reward was he had to do this job because it was his job. And, you can put a lot of these aspects of response in academia and other places on risk reward, the time play scales, and uncertainty and certainty. And, by far, no means am I going to compare an oil spill to COVID. And I think science has been wrongly treated in a lot of places. And I think one of the biggest issues is that folks don't understand how science works. It's not the science. They don't understand how science works. About tenure and things change and all these things. And I try to explain to people that, crises aren't, science wasn't built for crises. We don't move that fast. And if science was a sport, it would be baseball. It's very slow, 162 games. It moves slow. It goes back and forth. These little corrections, like a team loses and wins. And a lot of the other stakeholders, like it or not, are much more interested in a very fast-paced game of soccer. And I think science has a hard time being the way in which our culture is, and what is our and how we're evaluated, and what is considered success for us. So from then on, after Deepwater Horizon, and I'm not kidding you, when I got involved in a response as an academic, I'd often say, if I do this, is Steve going to be mad at me? Not honestly, there were probably times when I knew that Steve might be mad, but I thought that it was in the best interest to society or maybe other folks. So by no means was I letting me trying to make Steve happy. Like, I wasn't in the business of pleasing Steve, but I was thinking about whether an action that I was going to do was going to affect a response, because it wasn't a game anymore. Like, I recognized that this is one thing I learned from Deepwater Horizon, is walking these beaches and picking up oil, and you're hearing from people asking you when they can feed their family again, that this wasn't just publishing a really cool paper or getting the cover of a journal. Was that what I said and what I did and the science I did was going to people's bellies and their wallets. And walking the beaches of Deepwater Horizon was another moment in my life about the personal connection. That when I got out of the lab and I got out of my office, you can learn a lot about being a good scientist. And this is my personal opinion. Scientists can do whatever they want and follow the rules in which they want to. But in my case, it became very clear around 2010 that arguably after every oil spill, the most affected living being most likely to be injured was, and perhaps the hardest hit, was people. And I recognized that what I did and what I said could affect the people, and that it wasn't a game anymore. So my takeaways, there's a lot of them. And I mean, there's no shortage of these conversations about how we can have, more of a kumbaya. And I'm not discounting, I mean, I shouldn't say kumbaya like that. I'm not discounting them in any ways. I think they're great. But I can tell you that we should not have heart-to-heart conversations or discuss these things with email. I was super lucky to have Rick Gaines straighten me out. I was perfectly willing to change. And I'm a firm believer that having a coffee with Steve Lehman was much better than an email. And so thinking past, knowing your audience, it's more of having coffee with the audience, eating lunch with the audience, and hearing them in a much more candid way when there isn't any pressure on. So we don't have to worry about the incredible acceleration of what happens during a crisis. So if it was me, I was trying to have a better relationship with the response community as an academic. I'd make Exxon or API buy us lunch every day. And, that every culture is a different stakeholder. And, we want to think about, when I think about different stakeholders, I think about what their timescales are, how they, where is certainty in their realm, what is the risk and what is the reward. So 18 years later, after the Bouchard 120 oil spill, and lots of opportunities, super lucky, met a lot of folks, learned a lot of things. Deepwater Horizon for me was completely, changing in my life. And I would say one of the benefits is just how many people I got to meet and know, and, how many friends I got to meet. My wife calls me before and after Deepwater Horizon. That's how she refers it to me. And I tend to think it might be better. I'm better now. But Steve probably has a play in there too. So I'm going to fast forward. I'm going to talk for another 5 or 6 minutes about the Express Pearl. And this is a cargo ship, and kind of the science and my role and what I did with thinking about whether or not Steve would be, would Steve call me a guerrilla geochemist? Express Pearl was a cargo ship laden with lots of different chemicals, polymers and resins, nitric acid, elemental sulfur. It left Qatar and UAE on May 10th. Started to have a problem. Noticed that it was leaking nitric acid on the ship. A couple of days, I can't remember right now. A couple of days before May 20th. Was trying to find a place to tie up, and the Sri Lankans, said you can tie up offshore. We'll try to figure out how we can help you. And that nitric acid leak became a fire on the ship, and it was a terrible time. And one of the cargoes on that ship was small little pieces of plastic, nurdles. These the pieces of plastic that are pre-production plastics that you'd use for raw material, just a raw material. And very early on, these pieces of pre-production plastic, these nurdles, started to show up on the beach, to the point where 75% of the Sri Lankan coastline was covered with nurdles, whether they were more standard or whether or not they were burnt, across a continuum of different burntness. So early on, I got a phone call from one of my closest friends, Lahini Alohari at Scripps, and she said, I have a really close friend of mine, Asha DeVos, who's in Sri Lanka. Could you talk to her about things that we should, there's fuel oil on the ship, the underway fuel, there's other chemicals, the nitric acid, the plastic. Could you just give her some input? She's a really talented scientist, conservationist, who has her own NGO called Ocean Swell, and she was very keen to communicate solid science. And so I was hard bit to actually provide that science that could give knowledge, but not amplify concerns or fears. And, one of the things that became very clear to me when I was speaking to not necessarily Asha, but other folks and the press and kind of the perception about the Express Pearl, in May 21, was this idea that, an oil spill or another release is just, it's, you're just titrating a pollutant into a beaker or a round bottom flask in this case. And I was really trying to drive home the reality of this event, that there were concerns of acid rain from all the burning of materials. This was a ship that was sunk during the seasonal monsoon with 6-foot seas, releasing nitric acid and a cargo just loaded with many more chemicals that had not been released. That alone just underscores the challenges that the response community faced with the Express Pearl. Of course, then you can add the pandemic. There's no doubt that this was a huge challenge, and I will say the Sri Lankans, I think, did fantastic responding to it. So anyways, my relationship with Asha, who's on the other side of the world in Sri Lanka, I was talking to her about what chemicals would persist, likelihood of injury, talked about a lot of things that I was trying to do to give her information, but that was pretty clean and clear. Asha started showing me pictures on the beach that she was collecting not too far from where she lived, and she was showing me these pieces of plastic that was coming from the Express Pearl. Some of them looked pretty pristine, and others looked like not like plastic anymore. And they were black and they were dark. And it came clear to me that I asked her, I was like, can you send me some of these samples? And I was thinking about, from a response community, that this wasn't a single entity, that a nurdle spill here, that, looking at these images that she had sent to me, that it's entirely possible that some of the burnt nurdles would not be seen, or maybe they would transport differently. And so she sent me some samples. They came to my lab on June 11th. I was kind of following also the oil, following some really great work that ITOF was putting up, and got in contact through Asha with Connor Bolus at ITOF, who's boots on the ground there. And we started to exchange emails, and I was trying to give him the knowledge that we had and things that we were thinking about. And it was an incredibly fruitful exchange. And then we were able, within about 2 weeks of getting the samples, we made a fact sheet of what we knew. My lab group and other folks in Woods Hole and other colleagues from our world, we put together a fact sheet, and we explained what we learned and what are the things that we were thinking about, and what might be different. And we were trying to frame this as here's the information that other folks should know about. And, you should be thinking about these and using that in your own calculus. One of the big issues that was coming up at that time was that there were other nurdle spills that had happened. And there was a lot of folks were arguing while we were holding these samples. And the burnt ones were brittle. Like, you actually could make them much smaller and finer than the non-ones, the ones that weren't burnt, like the ones that were released here. And they were also all recognized as non-hazardous. And there was there were folks in the Sri Lankan government that were saying a nurdle is a nurdle. When we were looking at that data, we didn't think that that might be the case. And that was one of our big drivers, was to provide information to the response community and the people, the Sri Lankan government and the media, that this might be a bigger challenging issue, and to think about it, not necessarily do it, but we provided recommendations. And, we were following the nurdle release, and we got these samples that look like this. And when we first started analyzing these samples, so we got the samples on June 11th. So between June 11th and June 23rd, we started analyzing these samples with a bunch of different colleagues. First thing we did was weigh them. And we measured their, the scale in terms of, width and thickness, and whether or not, their circularity, and, nothing fancy, but it was very clear that just a simple way to that the burnt plastics were much smaller. They could even be much bigger. They had different colors, different sizes. It was clear that this was really important information that needed to be translated. We were seeing things like this, of pieces of plastic that were very different, and I thought were useful to the response community. And I was beating a drum to a lot of my colleagues that this is the type of information that the response community should know about, that, that we had an opportunity in our lab where it wasn't so chaotic. We had the infrastructure to do this work. And I was unbelievable images. Not one of these pieces of neurals looks the same. Here's a burnt one that kind of swallowed up unburnt one. And one of my colleagues, as I was talking about why we needed to communicate these results in a clear way, was pretty incredulous. Her point was, this isn't very cutting edge, and that the science of using a ruler and a balance is not worth communicating. And to me, this was a big disconnect, and really kind of a life lesson that I was able to explain to this person about the science and the knowledge that the response community needs versus what we need to get tenure. And that I thought that size and shape would be useful to be passing along in a clean, clear way that was useful. And that we didn't need fancy equipment. At that moment, pretty chromatograms were not actionable information, whereas size, shape, distribution, color, these were types of information that I thought was valuable to the response committee. I was just lucky. I was lucky to hang around folks like Steve Lehman and others and appreciate that disconnect and not revisiting that mistake I had made in 2003, where I told my audience about cutting edge stuff. And in reality, I probably could have given more discussion about the oil that was there, and actually truly tell them that it wasn't going to be another West Falmouth spill. That consultant was right, and I knew that, but I could have made a stronger case there. And instead of telling them all the cool stuff that I was going to do in 3 or 4 years later. So we put this fact sheet together, and we put out very clear ways about color and shape and size and how that might affect the fate and the transport, and how that might affect cleanups. It was entirely possible that when we spoke to a physical oceanographer, a fluid mechanic, woman named Michelle DiBenedetto at UW in Seattle, she was showing that the transport would be much different. That it was entirely possible that some of the burnt plastics were not going to come up on the shore because their size and their shape had changed. And so we put this fact sheet together. State Department asked me to talk about this on July 1, and I spent a lot of time during that talk. And it was mostly geared to the media. So the US State Department asked me to kind of brief to the media about how science works during a crisis. And I spent a lot of time talking about recovery and about the chaos and about the challenges that you face during a response. And that, there's many different pieces and pies. And I was really driving home this concept, and in some respects, this is me also defending science during the COVID as well, that science is an infinite jigsaw puzzle, and that we change, and it's never ending, and you can work on different pieces, and we just don't work fast. So if some things are going to change, and we have to accept that as moving forward, as opposed to it being a loss. That things change, but that usually means a good thing for us. But when things change, it looks like we change our mind to other stakeholders. It looks like a failure. And I spent a lot of time talking about that. So I'm just tying up right here. Ship's still there, and most of the cargo is still there. So this is still a threat that still exists. And we were lucky to publish our first paper on this. And I was very keen to get this paper out, and in part because I wanted to publish a paper during an ongoing response. And I thought that providing our information in a way that was peer reviewed might be useful, a useful tool to other players to show that the data was there and available to make the most well-informed decisions and to lessen damages. put together this kind of cartoon and things that we're thinking about. And we continue to this day. One of my postdocs, Brian James, and I continue to work and exchange with Connor and other folks at ITOF. One of the things that we're starting to see is that plain old nurdle, plain old piece of plastic, on May 25th, a couple of days, you know, fire catches on, and 10 miles away, you go from pristine nurdles to pieces of plastic that have all these different sizes and shapes, and just really underscoring the challenges and about how this beast, this plastic, our enemy, changed. And it became clear that the science at this point may not be as directed towards maybe the response, but more about what can you learn from this uninvited guest on a grander, more global scale. There's a lot of plastic that gets burnt, pyroplastic, whether for waste incineration and other places. And we thought that this was an opportunity to have a timestamp on a burned piece of plastic and start thinking about it in the long term. And, you know, I think that's one of the really fun parts of my career, is being able to be involved in the response and provide information, and then pivot to thinking about that more kind of a basic science, or maybe, you know, an interest on a much grander scale than the local area of this response. Now, just pivoting to all you folks know, I mean, this shipping containers are all over the world. And, you know, if you look at the, you see what's on the cargo of the Express Pearl, you start to appreciate just how complex these different materials are, and the chemicals that folks would be facing during a response. And I think it's tough. I think there's, you know, I'm hoping that there are no accidents, but I think if they happen, they're going to be challenging, because you're going to have to be outside the box. I think that, at least in the United States, I think we're well positioned. I think there's a lot of talented folks that can use the knowledge gained from an oil spill to respond to whether it's pieces of plastic or hydrogen peroxide. You know, there's kind of a knowledge base that every chemical has a different personality, and has a different threat in the short term and the long term. So just tying up, this is my last slide. You know, thing I learned in 18 years is that first impressions can be wrong. You know, coffee, or in this case, Steve was, you know, sitting at a bar before dinner, really understanding and kind of respecting. You don't have to agree with other stakeholders and players, but you do, you know, you would be better off if you had an understanding and respect for them. And, you know, we're still working on this Express Pearl, but I think it's a really tough response. And, you know, we're still trying to get some idea of mass balance, and trying to figure out where all these burnt plastics are, and what kind of potential injury they are in the short term and the long term, and how that you know, that pre-exposure of fire, how does it dictate its long-term fate? And I think that the Express Pearl is a really powerful and unfortunate example about the challenges that the response community faces for cargo vessels, and just how diverse of a products that they are carrying, and unfortunate if they release. So yeah, I'm super lucky, thanking a ton of people here. And once again, thanking Tim and Lynn for inviting me. And I put my email up earlier at the first slide. If you have any feedback, you know, shoot me an email. Happy to talk. I'm not very good at responding to emails. So if you don't hear from me, just respond to me again and say you promised you would respond. So anyways, thanks, Tim. I'm all set.
Oh, Chris, that was perfect, right? So what I'm trying to do with this webinar series is get perspectives from different groups, and so we can all kind of come to an understanding of what's kind of some of the motivators for how we think and act. And so this talk has really hit it right on the nail there. So I appreciate it. I want to mention I got a text message from Steve Lehman. He's listening, by the way.
Oh my God.
And so
hey, Steve, how's it going?
I'm glad you turned around the rumpled pants terrible talk to, you know, you're full of respect for him before you finish.
Oh no, Steve's fantastic.
Yeah, so Steve's comment was, it's a universal truth, drinking helps everything. Comments on your barroom meeting.
Yeah.
So while we're getting questions coming in, let me just mention something, and it kind of follows on this theme here, right? It's really struck me. I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was in an RT6 meeting in Dallas, outside of Dallas, and so the RT6 meeting is usually almost completely populated. Those meetings have 40 or 50 people, and they're all really intimately involved in the response. And then occasionally we'll get an academic to come in. And about 4 years ago, an academic came in and said, he was trying to describe, well, how do we get academics more involved in the response side of things? And it struck me when he was talking that what he's suggesting is never going to work. And it's kind of what you described here, right? He has a completely different reward system. And at that meeting was one of the coordinators of the RT6 meetings was retiring. And it struck me that the guy who was retiring, he'd been to every meeting I'd been, right? He'd been to every one of them. He went to every meeting. Well, why did he go to every meeting? Because his boss expected him to be at every meeting. If he didn't go to every meeting, his reward system would slow down, right? And he would have problems. And the academic was not only at that one meeting, right? I've been to a few meetings because my boss expects me to be at meetings like that. And his boss didn't expect him to be at meetings because his reward system is what you said, right? Your reward is getting tenure, publishing papers, getting grants, and influencing things. And it's not attending our RT6 meetings because it's not likely that any of those, attending that meeting is going to influence your ability to get grant money, your ability to write papers and things.
Yeah, for the most part, that's true. Yeah.
So we need to understand each other's, what drives each other's, actions. And that's a kind of a fundamental difference, is that the responders are there. Steve wants to make what he knows is going to be bad less bad, right? And he can't wait, as you said, he can't wait a week for the answer, right? He has to have the nurdles are this shape and this shape, right? Look for these things, right? And then make your decisions, right, based on this fundamental information that I can give you right now. If you told him 10 weeks later that this is how the nurdles are going to look after it doesn't help, right? It doesn't do anything. So understanding those different perspectives is really important. And so I just wanted to add that you and I talked about this, Chris, and I wanted to mention it to the group, that I think one of the ways we need to, in the United States at least, is we need to figure out how to get an oil spill response center of excellence funded with some long-term funding. And I mentioned how there's some NSF funding that comes around every few years. And so we need to, as a group, I think a community, we need to have academics and the response community that sit in this oil spill response center of excellence that's doing consistent research over long periods of time, so we keep the academic side and the response side in kind of under the same roof, so they can communicate with each other. But we meet what drives the academic side of this research and response field in the business for longer periods of time. And so they don't just hop into the business after a big spill when there's a lot of funding, and then they go on to other things, because that's what you have to do when you're academic, when there's not research funding.
It's mutually beneficial. I mean, we could talk about this forever and stuff like that. Defending a scientist, we're trying to find interesting cases. We're trying to learn how the world works. And oil spills are unbelievable. You can never get funded or permission to do an oil spill. I mean, oil spill is just a rapid release of highly reduced carbon in a coastal environment. So, at the end of the day, it's not that, a lot of academics get kind of beat up or, from other folks, but they don't appreciate exactly what our jobs are, and that we do not do well with uncertainty. We don't like to live in the 70s. 70 does not get you tenure.
Yeah, no, I mean,
and so I would say that this center of excellence starts off with trust and respect and appreciation, and then having ideas about how you can have funded projects that hit the list of what helps you out, but also is stimulating and moves the scientific field forward. And there's no shortage of those ideas.
Yeah, so I think we should continue to talk about that offline. If people on this call have some thoughts on how, what some funding sources is, because I think I have a benefit being working for ExxonMobil, and I'm on the research side of the corporation, but I also get to speak whenever I want to the responders. And so the researchers and the responders that get their hands dirty need to communicate consistently enough. And we need to figure out how to understand what motivates these different groups to make sure that they do these consistent communications. And so somehow, I think going in the future, we need to figure out how to do that. So we can talk about that.
Sure.
Offline. So we're getting quite a number of questions here. So why don't I just start going through the questions, and Lynn, help me out if I miss something, because sometimes this is a little confusing in Zoom. But the first question is, Chris, because of the nature of how science works, as you mentioned, it is possible to skew the science or the science results or findings to support a predetermined agenda or desired outcome. I'm sure we've all seen that to some extent. Integrity is certainly a high order asset that academic and other scientists must embrace to build trust and confidence with the response community. Any thoughts on this is the question.
Couldn't say any better. I mean, the thing that we have to remember is that for the most part, we can say no. I mean, it's hard to say it, but yeah, I absolutely agree. Leaving the ivory tower is super risky. And it frustrates me sometimes when senior administration and academia encourage us to be, more involved, but they don't necessarily have your back when things go a little sideways. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a tough place, and I would tell people to move carefully for these very reasons. We're not going to change academia that fast.
Yeah,
it's a risk. And that's it. I totally agree with that point.
Yeah, just one of the challenges I see is that, someone will publish some papers and it'll get a lot of recognition. It'll the cover of a journal. And then a couple years later, there's additional research that shows that maybe those conclusions weren't completely on target, at least. And it's just human nature. It's to stick by your guns on those conclusions, right? Especially when you've got a lot of recognition and your reputation can be, to some extent, at stake. And so it's hard to turn when new science kind of, not if it completely refutes your conclusions, it's easy to turn. But when it partly does, it's sometimes people stay by their, stick their guns longer than they should, and it's quite challenging sometimes.
And there's a huge latency too, right? I mean, I'm not a responder, but the response community cannot live off one paper to suddenly change their whole mechanism. I don't know when you folks make a decision about how you might pivot off, but it can't be just one paper. It's not financially wise. It's not, you're going against so much experience. I don't know when you pivot, but that's something I tell scientists all the time, is that there might be a better sorbent out there, but if it's just 2% better than what they have on every warehouse in the coastline, they're not going to change. It's not worth it from the potential failure when you have all this pre-existing knowledge about what's already there. And that's a huge challenge for scientists to appreciate.
Yes.
That challenge that, science moves forward, but there needs to be a huge amount of knowledge base before you can change things, not because of hesitance, but simply based on practicality.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have stockpile. The industry has huge stockpiles that cost millions and millions of dollars, and they're not going to be abandoned for an incremental advance in the technology that we're using or a new tech. It's got to be a step change advance to some extent for it to really be ready to be adopted in any time frame that's meaningful, actually. Okay, let me go to the next question. So Chris, thanks for the wonderful observations, humility, and the nod to the work of the NOAA SSCs. You're one of the academics who is prepared to respond to oil spills shortly after they occur. Over the years, we have tried to find ways to keep academics and NGOs involved in preparedness for spill. Can you comment on ways academicians, I'm saying that wrong, can be prepared to respond, become involved in enriching spill response, science, and the NERDA process?
I would have, like it or not, I've seen emails where sometimes we feel, the academic community feel like we're fair-weathered friends. And if we don't deliver, then we're suddenly discounted. I'm not that smart, but what I would say is having folks like the SSSCs and other folks actually being boots on the ground and finding folks who, exactly this, not exchanging business cards at a crisis. You guys have a huge load of materials and work, but, to me, I think you could go a long way by visiting schools and not necessarily giving a canned lecture. And I'm not knocking you guys at all, but actually having a lecture about, the anthropology, about the culture and the language and things like that. I think that is where I'd start, is really truly explaining, what our value systems are. But somebody's got to give up the time. You guys are responding all the time, but at the end of the day, the email assault of these things, it just doesn't work. We move so slowly and our lives are so planned out. My first bet is to get people in a room. Don't have have an agenda. Don't try to do it at a seminar series or an international meeting. People are too distracted. Have these types of relationships that people feel like they have a level of trust and respect, and that is the goal. Not to talk about the science. I'd actually say the first goal is actually, exchanging business cards.
Okay. No, great. Listen, I'm not mentioning people's names on these questions, although I see these names and questions.
Hey, tell them if they want. Yeah, tell them if they're cool. I'd love to say hi to whoever it is. So.
Well, the problem is that we have these privacy protocols, and if this API thing, and I need to get a document from them. So I apologize for keeping this kind of incognito, but I got a comment here. Nice talk, Chris. I had a very similar experience with Steve Lehman early in my career that shifted my understanding on the importance of seeing things from perspectives other than my own. I'll tell you, when I first, so I'm going to say just the opposite about your first interaction with Steve and his presentation. In 2006, I gave a talk at a workshop in St. John's, Newfoundland, and Steve was there. And I think I talked right after him. And I just started into the oil spill business, and I had all these kind of ideas on how we improve things, and I was going to talk about some of those things. And I remember Steve got up before me and spoke, and Steve has a much kind of stronger voice, right? He should be a radio, a disc jockey or something, because he's got this kind of strong, deep, authoritative voice. And he went up and gave such a really good talk, I thought, that it kind of threw me off guard, because I thought, I'm going to be the keynote speaker here because I'm doing all this great work. And so rumpled jeans, and maybe he got more sleep before he gave that talk, but I had kind of the completely. And in fact, it threw me off guard, because I'm like, how do I compete with somebody who could speak like that? And I remember thinking that specifically. Okay, here we go. Chris, any thoughts on academics interaction?
No,
go ahead.
No, but I immediately come to mind that the SSSCs and other response communities are super slammed right now. So I think that maybe the powers that be hire folks like Ed Levine and Steve and be the ambassadors to try to explain how the world works. So I don't know if I'm not trying to get Steve a side hustle, but I think that might be a fit.
That's another one of the things I think is that the organizations that have resources for funding oil spill response research need to have a set of kind of go-to consultants that act as liaisons between the people that write proposals and start doing research and the fundies, right? We need the groups that have the resources to rely on some of the people that have got their hands dirty, and Steve Lehman and Ed Levine and others have been doing it for they've got their hands dirty for a long time. So they're going to know, they're going to know immediately if this is a good idea or not, right? And so there needs to be a set of consultants that help support some of this, even writing requests for proposals, right? And I think the expertise that those guys have could be utilized more than it is now for the research side of things.
Sure.
Okay, Chris, any thoughts on academic interaction with the press? It strikes me that the press is looking for a big story and tend to spin what they are told, and that can give academics attention even if the results are not really interpreted quite correctly.
Yeah, that's a semester-long class. At the end of the day, if you don't feel comfortable having those interviews, don't do it. If you're not quite sure about giving an interview, I would get my press liaison officer at my university to sit with me, or have another friend sit in on a Zoom meeting. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's challenging. Even thinking about making mistakes. The media can make a mistake, and now it's completely forgotten. Maybe they put an errata in the New York Times the next day. You make a mistake in academia, that don't go away. Sometimes. So I do think that this is another aspect of risk, and how do you minimize risk? But at the end of the day, you have to communicate to scientists that it is tricky. And I think sometimes you just have to say no, like it or not. I think it's really hard. It's not easy. And there is no expectation that it should be easy. You don't have, not every culture and different stakeholder has to mesh perfectly. You might be just willing to accept the fact that sometimes they just don't work well, or that, might work for others. And, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I'll tell you an insight. So for anyone at ExxonMobil to give an interview to the press, which is, something that you don't do just off the cuff, but you have to take media training. Yeah. And you don't really realize how your thinking changes when so in the media training, you do some actual, and they're all staged and everything's fake.
Yeah.
But when you have a microphone in front of you and they'll bring somebody out with a camera and put it in your face, and even in the media training, how you react to that is just striking, right? The pressure and the difference of that, and that's what knowing that you're in a course where at the end nobody's going to be listening to you other than yourself. And I have stories from the media training about some of the people I took it with that I tell at parties because they were so ridiculous. I tell at parties that people don't even know them, right? Because some of the ways they acted when the camera went on and the lights went on and there was a microphone in their face, even though it wasn't. So the pressure of that interaction is something that's just a new animal that if you haven't been exposed to it, even in something like media training, I think you might not even be able to think straightly, or you might say things that you wish you hadn't said because you're not yourself until you get accustomed to it.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges academia has is that somewhere or another, folks taking a 3-hour workshop and 1 5-minute dry run with a reporter giving you a few stamps you as prepared. Yep. And if you want to get good at anything in this world, I'm not sure you need 10,000 hours like Malcolm Gladwell, but a 3-hour workshop on how to communicate to the press that's just an appreciation. That's not a certificate of going for it. And I think, what I try to do when I give interviews now is I have my grad students and postdocs on the Zoom meetings, and I have them listen. Sometimes I might ask them a question. For the most part, I ask the reporter, can this person listen in? And then after the interview, I asked them to write a couple paragraphs about what their take was of the interview. And then once the piece gets published, I have them write a couple more sentences about the outcome of the piece and have that student or postdoc send it to both to the scientist and to the reporter. And I think those are the places where you make these teachable moments. I feel so bad for so many folks who sit up in the front of the room and they have to do this dry run for 3 minutes, and it is so embarrassing. And I think it's like the worst way to train people. If that's your 3-hour training and 10 or 20 minutes of it is sitting in front of a camera, that is not the way to do it. It is not a way to embrace people. It's not a way to engage people, and it's not a good way to make them feel good about themselves. If you're going to go and do media training, let's empower these people. Let's train them. Let's make them feel good about themselves and not make it this embarrassing event, which I've seen so many times. And my heart goes out to people.
Yeah, no, what media training taught me is that I suck at talking to the media, right? And the only way, right? And it makes you very clearly understand that, and not have this false hope that you are good at it. But it reinforces that it's a skill, and you have to do it to become comfortable in some way or another, right? Even just speaking in front of people more often this way. Yeah. All right, I'm not going to say this next person's name, but he has a comment for you. It says, from a government hack to a guerrilla geochemist. Great talk, my friend. Explaining the complex is difficult and you're good at it. 50% certainty day is better than 90% certainty in 2 weeks in the response community. So there you go. All right, here's another one. Thank you, Chris. I'm connecting with my local city folks regarding public awareness of response during incidents, i.e. the oil trains passing through Edmonds. You gave me a lot of thought. Another comment. Let's see. From the response standpoint, we always reserve the right to be smarter later, to quote Jerry Galt. All right, and last comment here. So we still have a little bit of time. If there's any other question, excellent session. Thanks for the invitation. Let me ask you. So I wrote this down in case our questions didn't come through, but since we have a couple more minutes, it would be great if you summarize what I mentioned at the beginning, right? What the key message was you gave to the National Academy of Science regarding, and it's kind of group psychology and how that group, the National Academy of Science. I mean, you were lobbying again with them to try to get them to put a psychologist or a psychologist on that committee, which I think was something that I hadn't thought of until then. But when you think about groupthink and how when the media says something and it's not necessarily accurate, but it really influences the psychology, and then that from a big spill like the Deepwater Horizon, that misinformation that comes out of this media report, and the guy doesn't really know exactly what he's saying. He's trying to take the worst case scenario and the sky is falling, and how that perspective turns to this group psychology for the public, and then that influences the politicians, and it comes back down and has influence on response decision. Is just not the way to, that's not the right cycle for decision making, obviously. So I know you had some really good
I
comments.
totally agree. I honestly, I remember that talk, but I do think that we have to think about putting a lot of this, like it or not, people think about oil spills and they think about dolphins. I think about oil spills, I think about people. I think that's how we want to start framing things. Obviously, we want to make the ocean cleaner and so, but at the end of the day, to me, the goal is how do we make people's lives and livelihoods and what they value better off? And if you frame it like that, instead of cleaning oil off a rock, which you need to do, I think that works sometimes. I would say a psychologist, sometimes folks think of them as spin doctors, but I do think that the human component about what matters to people, that when an oil hits the beach and that's where they got married, or that's where they, these things matter, and that is one thing I learned from Deepwater Horizon. I walked the beaches from, from Pensacola Beach all the way to Fushan. And, the thing you learn the most is that I have no idea the impact that spills have on people. And, maybe that's another aspect of training. I'm not sure how you could do it, is to add the human component of the people who actually been affected about an interview, or, how did that change? And, I saw so-and-so's put this on the news. How does that affect them? My advice to scientists is to start local. Often we want to go and go to Washington, D.C. and bang on the doors. My advice to the scientists is to go have coffee with maybe your environmental police, or maybe the Coast Guard's based by, or even go and talk to the local reporters about their jobs. So start local. It's a much better place to cut your teeth. Or even go see the theater department and the communications department in your own school. If you're going to be an interview, I make friends with somebody in the journalism school and have them sit in on your interviews.
Yep. Yeah, no. It's, having eyeballs on you and then a camera and a light changes how you react. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And so the way to get around that is to do it as often as possible, right? When it's not an emergency. Looks like we have one. Well, there's something else coming up, but we have one less comment here, and I'm not sure what he's responding to. I was thinking the opposite problem. Folks like the attention, which is, I think I agree with that. And that may be more important than the message being properly communicated to them. Sometimes it, not even direct interviews, but papers, results are misinterpreted. And I certainly understand that. The one paper doesn't change the whole thing is the problem. We need to be sure, because one of the things I talk about a lot is how it's a challenge to take beaker and basin tests and then extrapolate those to what happens in the real world, because of just a huge amount of constraints and bias that happens in a beaker compared to what happens in the ocean.
But, a lot of this is out of our control, right? I mean, listen, we're going to write great papers. They're going to get peer reviewed. They're going to get published. We can't control the narrative. We can do our best, but, a lot of scientists get beat up a little because they write a paper, but they're just trying to move science forward. And it's incremental, and it goes one step back and then two steps forward. And, you know, there are things, this world, we live in an imperfect world. And we have to accept the fact that all these different stakeholders in the media, you know, sometimes they want to amplify it to sell more newspapers, and it's unfortunate. But, you know, peer reviewed papers move the ball forward, and we have to keep doing that. But just to remind everybody, there is no expectation that this has to be the most harmonious thing. We just have to try to be as meshed as possible to have as good of an outcome so that we can make the people who are impacted better off.
Yeah, I don't think there's solutions to these problems, but understanding that these are problems, like understanding that the beaker is not the real world, right? And then when you make conclusions about your beaker test, you should try to couch them in what, you know, your expectations for the real world, or that, you know, academics have this different set of drivers, and you're never going to get them to come to each RRT6 meeting, right? Because they're not paid to be there, and their boss doesn't expect them to, right? Understanding those different perspectives is, you know, there may not be a solution to some of these things, but understanding them so you can think about them when you're trying to make decisions is important.
You know, I recognize your point about environmentally relevant, and that what happens in a beaker may not be the same as the coastline. But, you know, that gives some insight. You know, is it transferable all the time? No, but I think a lot of my colleagues in the peer review are trying their best to move the ball forward. You know, perhaps maybe they want to underscore the point that maybe that is not completely relevant, but I do think it shines light on trying to solve the problem. And I do think that's a big disconnect. And I think the environmental relevance and that translation gets lost, not necessarily with the scientists, but in between. It gets, you know, there's a little bit of a black box that sometimes things get a little lost. But yeah, I mean, we're trying our best, you know, and we have to somehow live together. So.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to say you shouldn't.
Yeah, no, I understand.
You got to do beaker tests. Right?
Yeah, you got to start someplace. Right?
But that understanding of how the, you know, what the biases are in these beaker tests needs to be highlighted in some papers better than it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, on the flip side, you know, it's not always practical to try to do it in the real world. Who's going to take, if you have limited assets in theater, who's going to take one of your best boats and some of your more competent people with limited resources and take a scientist out to collect some water? And at the end of the day, we're trying our best because we don't necessarily have access. But at the same time, responders, you know, they got to solve the problem right now. So, you know, that's the disconnect. We're trying our best, and, you know, but yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, I mean, even if you could do that, right? It's not, it doesn't replace the beaker test. You're trying to do controlled experiments, and your emergency spill is not a controlled experiment. So you can't change one variable at a time. And even if we could have just the luxury of doing field releases, it still wouldn't displace those things, because you still can't control Mother Nature when you're doing the field releases. So there has to be, you know, it'd be great if we could do more kind of controlled field experiments. I don't think that's happen anytime in the future. So we have the emergencies where we can try to do some things, but the lab tests are going to be the way to do science, right? Lab and basin tests is the way to do science, but there certainly needs to be caveats on before the extrapolation goes very far. Listen, we're right at our time limit here. We have no more questions. So listen, Chris, once again, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know you put a lot of thought into those slides, and I can tell that because what you showed us a few days ago is you've been thinking about it in the last few days, even, because it's morphed to something even better than what you showed us a few days ago. So I appreciate the time and effort to do this, and because you're not getting compensated other than I'm going to buy you a beer next time we're in Durham or something.
Hey, anybody wants this slide deck and use any of these slides as they see fit, just give me a holler. You can have them. You know, if it moves the ball forward, go for it. Just don't do the one with Steve and Rumple jeans. We don't want to have it taken out of context.
Well, he says he's now figured out how to use an iron.
All right.
Yeah, pleated jeans now. So great. All right. So now, I'm going to let everybody go. I'll reiterate what Lynn said. I was hoping that we could announce who our speaker was next year. We have next month. We have a couple people that are kind of in the books here, maybe. And so we'll send out an email once we firm that up. If we don't, we'll skip a month and we'll reconvene in April, I guess.